Kira and L are the most misunderstood characters in anime history. They're often praised as genius masterminds, playing 4D chess and debating morality like modern philosophers. But they're actually just a couple of dumb guys making dumb decisions over and over. In this analysis, we'll break down why they're not as smart as you think, how people completely miss the point of Death Note, and what our obsession with these characters reveals about us. First things first. Yes, Light has moments where he shows intelligence, but he's intelligent in a very short-sighted way. He has a tool that lets him eliminate people without leaving any trace or proof that he's guilty. Yet, in just a few chapters, the focus narrows from Kira can be anyone in the world to anyone in Japan, then to any student in Japan, then any student in the Kanto region, and finally, any student in the Kanto region with ties to the police. Also, if he hadn't used the Death Note on the fake L on TV, which, let's be honest, was very obvious it wasn't him, because why would L show his face, instantly making himself a target? Very likely no one would have known he was Kira, but that's not all. Even after this dumb move that made him suspect number one, any reasonable person would try not to do anything suspicious to avoid standing out. So what does he do? Exactly when they're about to remove him from the suspect list, he writes down Ray Penber's name, but not before making him write the names of all the FBI officers in Japan. You know, confidential information that only the police would have. This confirms that Kira is indeed someone inside the police, or at least someone with strong ties to it, which makes Light suspect number one again. And we have to remember that it's well known to everyone that Light has helped the police in several cases, demonstrating not only that he has a relationship with the police beyond just being the police chief's son, but also making it more credible that he has access to police information and is familiar with how the police operate. As if that wasn't enough, Ray Penber, the FBI agent, has a wife, Naomi Misora, who's not happy about what happened to her husband, so she decides to investigate who Kira is. Light eventually deals with her, but first, she's one more person on his trail that he could have easily avoided. And second, he was almost caught, only because Matsuda just happened to have an umbrella and couldn't see them clearly. Light talks to Naomi Misora right before she disappears. In broad daylight, on a busy street, if nobody saw them or reported it, after the news announced that a woman had disappeared, or mentioned it after the police questioned people or businesses near the last place she was seen before disappearing, that she had been walking with a young man who fits Light's description, one of the main suspects, well, there are still security cameras. But no, the series ignores all of that just so Light can stay free, and in the process, gives the impression that he's more clever than he actually is. But that's not all. Whenever Light's plans don't go as he wants, he essentially throws a tantrum saying everyone is stupid and doesn't understand him, that they don't understand the perfect world he wants to create. But a perfect world for whom? Light. What would that world look like? What's the economic policy of that world? Is it a democracy, monarchy, dictatorship, or something else? Light is quick to talk about being the god of the new world and loves inflating his narcissistic ego, but in all his planning, he never talks about anything beyond punishing criminals. That's a childish mindset, using magic to cleanse the world of evil, without understanding that many of the world's problems don't happen just because people are evil. The real world is full of complex issues caused by thousands of people with different goals, systems, and circumstances. Sometimes, a crime doesn't even have a clear person to blame. And even if someone is guilty, simply getting rid of them doesn't magically fix the problem. Many problems in the world have nothing to do with one specific person committing a crime. They're just the result of a long chain of circumstances. And L doesn't escape criticism either. According to Death Note 13, How to Read, a databook that shows us extra information about the Death Note world, we're told that L intentionally gives low probabilities even when he is fairly certain, in order to avoid alarming suspects or looking like he's jumping to conclusions. Although he never gives a percentage, it's clear that rather than just suspecting, he practically knows that Light is Kira. And yet, he invites him to work with him on the investigation, giving him more access to information. Yes, he does this to observe him closely, but this puts the entire operation at risk, and eventually allows Light to manipulate the situation for his benefit, leading to L's ultimate fate. Despite suspecting that Light is Kira, L doesn't impose strict measures to protect his identity. If he's supposedly doing this to throw off Light and somehow protect himself, since if something happened to him, it would be very obvious that Light is Kira. It sounds like a big brain move, until you realize that if L hadn't done that, Kira would have no way of knowing who he was. By that point, L knew that Kira needed the face and name of a person to eliminate them, and supposedly showing his face was something L never did, but he did it because who knows. Furthermore, L underestimates Light's manipulative capacity and doesn't protect himself enough. Light Light wins the match, not because he's much more intelligent, but because L made serious errors in judgment and strategy. In the end, L dies without having proven anything. His plan fails. And there goes the smartest character in the story, because yes, L, despite losing to Light, is still the smartest one. I actually find it funny that people are still debating, almost 20 years later, about who was more intelligent. But here's how I see it. Imagine we're playing a board game with 2 players. Player A doesn't know the rules, and player B does. Plus, player B has magical powers. And yet, player A almost manages to win. It's pretty clear that player A is way more intelligent. L didn't know who Kira was, where Kira was, and didn't know how Kira operated, and had no way of knowing since Light literally used magic, and yet he almost caught him. I think it's obvious who had the advantage here. Light. Yes, L had his millions, but that's nothing compared to having basically magical powers and a Shinigami that can help you do whatever you want and that nobody else can see. Plus, without having done anything, you get such a broken ability as the Shinigami Eyes thanks to your girlfriend who's willing to do anything for you. The one at a disadvantage was L, not Kira. But why do so many people still stick with the opposite idea, thinking that L and Kira were equally brilliant geniuses? Well, that's what this analysis is really about. Understanding why so many people, including myself for a long time, fell into that trap helps explain not only Death Note's massive and lasting success, but also, strange as it may sound, why the world is in the state it's in today. Trust me, I'm not crazy. This is going somewhere. I want to start by saying that I like Death Note. It's one of my favorite anime, and I'm one of those who, although recognizing that the last part of the series loses steam, thinks it's pretty good all things considered. Let's start from the beginning. What is Death Note really about? Most people will tell you it's about justice. You know, Kira thinks it's right to get rid of all criminals, while L believes that's wrong, and says people should be judged in a court of law. But is that really it? Because if we ask the creators themselves, the answer isn't so straightforward. Sure, they've mentioned justice as a theme, but more often they talk about things like morality, power, human will, and most notably, boredom, which, interestingly enough, is the title of the very first chapter of the manga. And that makes sense, because that's what starts the story. Ryuk is bored, so he drops the Death Note into the human world. Light is bored, so he notices the Death Note falling from the sky and picks it up. L is bored, so he decides to investigate the Kira case. And later in the story, once Light beats L, and he's no longer a problem, he gets bored. In other words, neither of them does what they do, because they truly believe in justice, or are trying to live by some noble ideal. They're just bored. Light loves to talk about how he only targets criminals. But take the chapter where he goes on a date and gets on the bus. He writes the name of the hijacker and makes him get run over. At no point does he stop to think about the innocent driver who now has to live with the trauma of having killed someone. Or what about people who were wrongly convicted? Or those who pled guilty just to avoid a harsher sentence? Maybe because they couldn't afford a lawyer, or they had a child depending on them, and jail would mean losing everything. What if the person is already in prison and serving their sentence? That doesn't sound like justice to me. That sounds like what a child imagines justice to be. The series literally says this through dialogue in its first chapters.
Based on the fact that Kira is only killing criminals, I think it's safe to assume that he's driven by a very idealistic notion of justice. It's highly possible he may even aspire to be some sort of godlike figure. We're dealing with an individual who has a very childish concept of right and wrong.
And it's even more childish when you discover that Japan, the country Light comes from, has a conviction rate of 99.99%. I might be wrong, but I think it's hard to believe that the Japanese police or government make so few mistakes. Suddenly, it doesn't sound so just. In L's case, if he's so certain that Light is Kira and is truly worried about what Light is doing, wouldn't it make more sense to, for example, catch him for any other crime he's committed and prevent more people from dying? I mean, there's a reason for the phrase that the average person commits 3 felonies a day. You know, they didn't get Al Capone for being a gangster, but for tax evasion. Or he could have used his incredible resources to deprive Light of his freedom, which he does in the series, but only after a long time of not being able to prove Light was Kira, and only because Light proposed that they imprison him. You could say that doing that to Light from the beginning goes against what L supposedly believes and fights for, but he had no problems torturing Misa for several days. If you think about it more deeply, we're never told that either of them went through some traumatic event that explains why they believe what they believe, like a family member who died tragically, or a friend who was unfairly sent to jail. There's nothing like that. And that's the point. Neither of them has a real reason for what they do. What really drives them is the thrill of the mind games, the challenge, the competition, the need to outsmart each other and prove who's the smartest. That's why, for example, L, despite knowing Light is Kira, never really does anything, because what he wants is to beat him, not prevent him from continuing to write names in the Death Note. And to those still defending Light, I remind you we're talking about the guy who, the moment he found out his sister was kidnapped, immediately considered writing her name in the Death Note if things didn't go his way.
If things go badly, may have to kill Sayu.
So yes, the story does explore themes of good and evil, but not justice, at least not in the way most people think. In fact, if it were really about justice, then L would be the one in the right. The series even makes that clear at the end of the manga. When Nier tells Light he's nothing more than a murderer.
You're just a murderer, Light Yagami.
Right before Light dies. And how does that happen? Well, Ryuk, the very character who Light always saw as a kinda dumb sidekick, keeps his promise from the beginning. He writes Light's name in the Death Note. And in that moment, we see the same man who spent the entire series thinking of himself as the god of a new world.
The only one who can create a new world is me.
Now begging for his life in the most pathetic way possible. Ryuk laughs in his face and tells him that after death, there's nothing, only the void. Seconds later, Light dies like a crushed insect in a lifeless, pitiful scene that leaves no doubt. The show's final stance is clear. Light was wrong all along. If you ask me what Death Note is really about, it comes down to two things: the dark side of people and immaturity. It's no coincidence that all the main characters have traits associated with kids. L loves sweets, Nier plays with toys, Mello is obsessed with chocolate, Mikami clings to a black and white sense of justice straight out of a children's story, and Misa is basically a spoiled girl in an adult's body. And then there's Light, just an angsty teenager who, despite having every door open to success, handsome, popular, top of his class, with a stable, loving family, and a father who's the police chief, which by the way, would have made his early dream of becoming a detective much easier to achieve, not to mention the fact that he was already helping with police cases. The guy was basically already living the life he supposedly wanted, or, for that matter, the kind of life most people could only dream of. Instead of appreciating everything he already had, he is a bored, emotionally clueless, and immature teenager who constantly complains about life, thinks everyone else is stupid, and believes he is a genius. He acts like if only he had the opportunity, he could fix all the world's problems, as if there was one true, right way, and that such things didn't depend on morality or individual perspective. You know, what's right for me might not be right for you. In other words, he is a dumb teenager who, because of his narcissism, never truly grew up or matured. That's why the chief is the character you could say is morally most correct, because he's an adult, not immature. This message of maturity versus immaturity is reinforced by the fact that Nier and Mello only managed to defeat Light when they stop behaving like siblings fighting over everything, mature, and decide to help each other to help defeat Kira.
Together we can surpass L.
And hey, if you didn't notice, I certainly didn't until someone pointed it out to me, Nier and Mello are meant to represent two sides of L's personality. One is analytical and cold, while the other is impulsive and less concerned with following legal procedures, so to speak. The fact that these two only managed to defeat Kira when they put their differences aside, stopped treating everything like a competition, as L and Light did, and realized there are more important things, like stopping Kira, than their sibling-like fights and egos, basically says that L was wrong. L was immature in his own way. He let his ego and the thrill of intellectual battle with Light blind him. He wasn't really trying to catch Kira because he thought it was the right thing to do. He was doing it because it was fun for him. And if you think about it more, it's explained in supplementary materials that the guy used his super intellect to earn millions in the stock market. If he cared so much about justice and people's welfare, wouldn't it make more sense for him to do things like open a charity or donate part of his money instead of spending it only on cases that, I should remind you, weren't the most important or dangerous, but only the ones that interested him, as if for him it was just a game. Because yes, the Kira case was obviously worth solving, but how many other important cases didn't he help with just because they didn't interest him? I know I might be exaggerating a bit here, but I think you get my point. But all this doesn't answer the initial question. Why did this message go over our heads for so long? And why, during the more than 20 years Death Note has existed, have we spent so much time debating who was right and putting L and Light on pedestals as super geniuses, when they clearly made so many mistakes? And what does that say about us as a society, as people? Something you notice when comparing the Death Note anime to the manga is how sometimes the anime, trying to look cool, prevents the series from properly exposing its themes, or causes them to be misinterpreted. This partly comes from its director, Tetsuro Araki. He's one of the anime directors with the most impressive resume in the entire industry, having worked not only on the mega success that is Death Note, but also on many other famous series like High School of the Dead, and also on the global mega phenomenon that was Attack on Titan. Specifically, he worked on the first seasons made by Studio Wit. It's important to emphasize which seasons he worked on, because the director's signature is the bombastic action scenes, full of screams, costumes, impossible shots, and music that makes your blood boil with excitement that we see in the earlier seasons, which contrasts with the later seasons, which he didn't work on, and that feel much calmer in comparison. The thing is that the man has the ability to make anything, like the action of eating a potato or writing in a book, feel like the most epic thing in the world. And I'm not going to lie, I like many of those scenes, and I think it's in no small part thanks to him that Death Note has the success it has, especially outside Japan. The problem is how sometimes these scenes can clash with what the story is trying to say, because the point of a scene might be that Light, Nier, or another character is doing something horrible, and in the script this is clear, but how it is shown might not be as clear. This brings about what I like to call the Wolf of Wall Street, or Scarface effect, where yes, what these characters are doing is wrong, but they look so cool doing it that doesn't it make you want to be them a little? As a result, despite the message of these movies, today you have bros idealizing them and shaping their lives based on what they see. It's a double-edged sword. You attract more viewers because your series is more appealing, but you also risk people missing the real message, as many of us did with Death Note in the 2000s. And it doesn't help that Light is constantly far from the action. I mean, if instead of using the Death Note he used a knife or a gun, I don't think people would perceive Light the same way. The Death Note is too clean. Plus, many times Kira's followers are the ones doing the dirty work, like storming buildings, which makes Light feel very removed from everything, as if he's not at fault, when in reality, he very much is. It's the same reason why many people, when you ask them to describe a crime, will tell you something like robbing a store, and not something like a CEO polluting the environment, or a rich person abusing financial tools for their benefit at the cost of millions of people's pensions and benefits, despite the fact that objectively, the last two examples do more damage and to more people than the robbery, as we can currently see with global warming, or the 2007-2008 financial crisis. It's harder to connect the criminal with the crime and its consequences when there are many steps in between. And of course, when you add that Light has great looks and is super charismatic, it becomes much easier for people to fall into his traps. Just like what happens in real life with politicians or other influential leaders. We get blinded by how they look and hear what we want to hear, but we don't stop to think about what they're actually saying or what their real intentions are behind the facade they put up.